Welcome, everybody. My name is Francisco Monaldi. I am the fellow in Latin American Energy Policy at the Center for Energy Studies at the Baker Institute. And on behalf of the Center for Energy Studies and the Institute, we welcome you to another of our sort of happy hour webinars on Fridays. Today, we will be discussing 3 regions of the world, how they've been affected by the current pandemic crisis and the energy and the price of energy collapse, and what will be the look for the future in those 3 regions. And so I have with me today Jim Crane, the Wilson Fellow on Energy Studies, who focuses on an expert on the Middle East, and Todd Moss, who is a non-resident fellow at the Center for Energy Studies, and who is also the executive director of the Energy Growth Hub and has and work in the State Department as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for Africa, so has an experience in that region and some interesting work on how issues of energy poverty and how to solve the resource scarce issues in countries that are highly dependent on oil and other resources. So these 3 regions include most of the 50 countries or so that can be classified as resource dependent, and they concentrate a lot of the reserves, oil reserves and gas reserves, and also minerals that are required for the energy transition, such as lithium and copper and cobalt and others. So it's very relevant for the energy markets, how these regions will fare after this pandemic crisis and with the low oil and gas prices that we are witnessing now. Particularly countries that are dependent, as many of these countries are, have had a difficult time since the decline of the oil price in 2014. These regions had a spectacular decade, sort of a golden decade, when the high commodity prices led by the growth in China allowed them to have really high growth rates. Many new producers appeared on the map in these regions. There were significant discoveries allowed by the high energy prices. And but the regions did not diversify or become less dependent of these resources. Quite the contrary, many of them became more dependent because they discovered resources. So the vulnerabilities of dependence and the so-called resource curse have been affecting these countries, and some of them, the ones that did not manage properly the oil boom, have been in a difficult time the last few years. The region that I focus on, which is Latin America, has a period of low growth, unpopular incumbents, increasing poverty and inequality that led in the last year or so to riots in Chile, in Ecuador, in Colombia. It led to the first incumbent losing a ever re-election in the history of South America, Mauricio Macri in Argentina. And of course, now with the COVID crisis, the region is in deep trouble. It was going to grow little this year, but now it's expected to GDP to decline by around 5% in the region, which will be the worst crisis that the region has faced since we have recorded statistics, much worse than the financial crisis for the region, in which the region fared relatively well because of China demand recovered quickly. So this will be a very challenging time for Latin America, and these countries many of them do not have the capacity to implement compensatory programs in terms of fiscal programs, and a significant proportion of the population is an informal sector and basically live day to day and cannot abide by quarantines. And so we're seeing now a very dramatic spike of contagions in Brazil. The management of the crisis, the health crisis by the populist presidents in Mexico and Brazil has been very poor, and as a result, the consequences could be very serious. And in some countries, the situation is just starting, but there are others like Peru and Chile that have managed the healthcare crisis relatively well. And as you would imagine, these are the more functional governments with better bureaucracies that have also managed better the macroeconomic situation. So there is a lot of heterogeneity in the region, but there is also a commonality of being affected by this commodity price decline in most countries. Not all, because there are some that are net importers of energy. And so with that, I would want to move to Jim and talk a little bit about how the Middle East was sort of the initial conditions before this crisis, and how they have fared with the pandemic and the oil price collapse in a region that, of course, is one of the most dependent on oil of any other region in the world. Please go ahead, Jim.
Okay, well, thanks, Francisco, for the excellent introduction, and welcome everybody. I hope you're geared up for a fun Memorial Day weekend if you're in the U.S., but not too fun. Okay, so Middle East. I'm going to talk a bit about the Middle East, and the Middle East region has already been fairly stressed for the past decade or so. I mean, we've had this is the second oil price crash since 2014, and that was coming on the heels of ISIS and the Arab Spring, lots of and the outbreak of civil war around the region. Now the IMF is predicting about a 3 to 4% drop region-wide in GDP just this year. So it's looking tough. Some of the structural factors that are contributing to it. I mean, we're going to talk about oil dependence, of course. I mean, around the region, in the big oil exporting countries, roughly 35 to 40% of GDP on average, and 75 to 80% of government budgets are from oil rents, oil export revenues. But the Middle East is, there's a bunch of vulnerabilities. First one is political violence. Okay, so this is the world's most authoritarian and violence-prone region. Roughly 10 times the refugees, internally displaced folks, and terrorist attacks, et cetera, than you'd expect based on the size of its population, as well as triple the global average in military spending, right? So this is a lot of what folks describe as part of the oil curse or the resource curse. Repression, government repression around the Middle East has been on the increase since the Arab Spring in many, if not most, countries. Also, lots of economic and social vulnerabilities, many of which predate the coronavirus, right? So some of these are oil-dependent economies that have underperformed with not much productivity growth, but they've also got some imbalances in labor markets, especially in the rich countries. They typically use oil rents to hire cheap expatriate labor. And then the poor countries are the labor sending countries that are dependent on those remittances, right? So sort of secondary dependence on oil rents. And I'll talk about how that has hurt them under coronavirus in a minute. But still, there's also youth unemployment around the Middle East, lots of that, and some educational deficiencies that have been going on for a while that have been actually improving. And actually, it's recently, especially in the Gulf, we've seen a real change in that in the gender gap in education. It used to be that girls and women, young women, were undereducated. Now it's the reverse. We've got the reverse gender gap in the Gulf now, with women being the bright spot in education and employment, and young men are those being left behind, actually. So some of these governments are beginning to develop policies to bring young men up to the level that women are attaining. And women are starting to take knowledge jobs and climb the ranks. But other vulnerabilities, another big one is tourism economies. Okay, so tourism, I mean, is getting hammered much harder than the oil sector is. I mean, the oil price is starting to climb back. Tourism is absolutely tanking. So you've got a bunch of countries exposed to that. I'll talk about a couple of them. Egypt is a major one that has perennial issues with its tourism sector. But Saudi Arabia is a big one right now. Many folks in the West don't think about Saudi as a tourism economy, but they've got huge amounts of religious tourism, the pilgrimage for the Hajj and the pilgrimage for the Umrah, both of which have been shut down temporarily. So that's a huge amount of revenue for the kingdom. Dubai has a full 12% of its GDP now is based on tourism. So Dubai's got just a massive tourism sector. 600 hotels, more than 100,000 hotel rooms in Dubai, and beyond that, even more structurally, the region has just overbuilt airlines. And so, they've all got these big state airlines and smaller budget carriers around the region that have been competing. We're looking for a major consolidation in the airline sector coming up in the Gulf. These countries have all deeply globalized their economies. I mean, this is partly, because they're so tied to the oil exports and then importing, but really deepened their ties to China, East Asia, and South Asia. That's where their energy is going, their energy commodities, and they're importing labor and technology from those countries, and also importing viruses now. I mean, that's one of the reasons Iran and Dubai were the first ones hit in the region. In Dubai's case, directly from Wuhan, appears to be visiting tourists from Wuhan. Dubai is a really popular destination for Chinese tourism. I've written a book on Dubai and described it as the most globalized, most cosmopolitan city in the world. I mean, only 5% of the population of Dubai is based as citizens. So it really depends on open borders, on freedom of movement, for its tourism and convention sectors, but also for its industries, right? For the airlines, trade, re-export industries around the region. Folks in Dubai are starting to compare this coronavirus crisis now to the old, in the 1930s, the pearl crash. I mean, another commodity that the Gulf was dependent on was pearl diving, when they were extremely isolated and poor. And in the 30s, Japan figured out how to culture pearls, and the Depression combined with that. And people were starving, right? So now the Dubai model has spread. Qatar, Oman, Abu Dhabi, Saudi Arabia have all adopted aspects of it, as have some other countries around the region. So, I expect that to be problematic as well. And then the last one of these issues is food security. The Middle East and North Africa imports almost 60% of the food calories that they consume. So, that has been a problem in the past. This time around, poor countries are most affected by that. So Syria, Yemen, of course, where civil wars are ongoing, but Lebanon, surprisingly, folks are going hungry in Lebanon now. And that's partially due to the depreciating Lebanese pound, against the dollar and the euro, making food unaffordable for folks there. So a real tough situation. I could just give a quick overview of what the coronavirus is doing in the region. So in terms of cases, of actual COVID-19 cases, from what I can gather, Turkey looks like it's near the top, or at the top, with somewhere around 200,000 cases. Iran below that at about 150,000. And then Saudi Arabia, about 70,000 cases, but growing really fast. In terms of new cases, it was number 4 worldwide yesterday. Okay, so ahead of everybody but the US, Russia, and the UK. And then, even more surprisingly, Qatar, tiny little country, 40,000 cases, growing very fast with the highest infection rate in the Middle East. Number 3 globally, okay? And then Yemen, I'll mention also. One single healthcare center in the south, in Aden, had 68 deaths at one hospital this week, more than double the official nationwide total. So a lot of this is because of the big jump. The big jump in cases is being attributed to Ramadan in the region. A lot of folks gather at iftar dinners, and there's public gatherings at people's homes and in tents, et cetera, with speakers and musicians. It's a time of lots of dinner parties, et cetera, and that is part of it. On the bright side of this, the UAE has been, it was an early hotspot, as I mentioned, now slowing. And Abu Dhabi opened a high capacity test lab, the largest one outside of China. And their testing rate for COVID-19 is the highest in the world globally, other than 3 small island states. So they've been doing a great job on that, keeping the cases under 30,000, and they're now starting to lift restrictions. I think it's also important to mention all Middle Eastern countries except for Qatar, have a lower infection rate than the United States. Okay, so when I talk to people there, they're worried about us more than they're worried about themselves. And if I could just finish this up with just a quick look at the policy making around coronavirus, I think it's a little easier in that part of the world. I mean, first of all, they had some familiarity already with coronavirus type inflictions with MERS, with the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. But secondly, the autocratic nature of rule in these countries helps them streamline policy making. So they've been able to take some pretty draconian measures that have been successful in some areas. So like the UAE, with the busiest international airport in the world, Dubai International, halting all air traffic in March. And we're just now seeing that resume. 24/7 curfews in Saudi Arabia, in Kuwait, in Dubai. Dubai, interestingly, really good with online governments, e-governance as they call it. You needed a police permit to go out to the pharmacy or the grocery store, hit the ATM. Easy to get with your phone. You just log in, get your police permit, state your business, and you'd get a short period where you could dash out of your apartment, take care of your business. But not if you didn't wear a mask. You can get fined or actually face jail time in a lot of these countries. And in Qatar now, you face jail time for not downloading the contact tracing app. So it's easier for them. In some of the poor countries around the Middle East, less globalized and less globally mobile populations have protected them. I think things will start ramping up there later. So I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Jim. So there are some parallels with Latin America, but some big differences. For example, in Latin America, you don't have any of these very strong-handed government measures, and it's pretty hard to make people comply with some of the regulations. Although in some countries they are trying to get them to comply. So now we move on to Africa, another region heavily dependent, but of course in a different with different issues, energy poverty, for example, compared to the Middle East and even to Latin America, but also heavy dependence and tremendous, of course, potential in the production of both minerals and oil. So what were the conditions in Africa to start with, and how does this crisis affected so far? Go ahead, Tom.
Great. Well, thank you, Francisco, and great to be with everybody. Thrilling to see so many people thinking about emerging markets on a Friday afternoon before Memorial Day. Look, for Africa, it's hard to characterize a very diverse continent of, a billion people in 54 nations. The response is extremely uneven. So a country like Ghana is actually responding really well. It's one of the probably one of the models of the world in the response to COVID. And on the other side, you've got a country like Tanzania, where the president is actually in denial that COVID is real. So it's a very diverse picture. Say there's actually a couple of things that Africa has in its favor in terms of the severity of the crisis. One is demographics. The population is just very, very young, and because they're not dealing with the similar demographic issues that we have in the United States or in Europe or Japan, which is really hitting the elderly population. And the other benefit that Africa has is that they're actually already prepared for surveillance. The Ebola outbreak was a good trial run for populations that are used to heavy amounts of public health surveillance and occasional shutdowns. So while for many of us, this is the weirdest thing we've ever experienced, it's not necessarily the first time for a lot of people, particularly in West and Central Africa. Now, a lot of the trends that Francisco mentioned in Latin America are kind of similar, but even more extreme in Africa. Certainly, a lot of the health systems are less capable to deal with a public health crisis. Many of Africa's cities are very dense. Some of the informal settlements, you have a lot of people living in a very small space, which obviously helps provide a vector for the virus. And economically, the flexibility is also just far, far less than other regions. Governments just don't have the fiscal space to inflate in the way that, for instance, we're doing, or parts of Europe or even Latin America or the Middle East can do. There has been an international response. The World Bank, for example, has put all debt service payments on a hiatus until the end of the year if a country makes that request. And notably, several countries are hesitating to make that request because they hope to go back to the bond markets soon, and they don't want this to affect their risk profile. But some of the multilateral development agencies are ramping up spending. Just as an example, this week, the World Bank approved $1 billion for Kenya. And while $1 billion probably doesn't sound like much for Brazil or Mexico or Saudi, it's actually a lot of money in Kenya. But I do think that in the energy sector, really the biggest factor is going to be the flight of capital and the curtailment of investment. Frontier markets are always hit the hardest when we have a global shock, and we're definitely seeing that now in the energy sector. And my regular work is mostly on power systems and electricity, and it's very stark when we think of lockdowns at home, and we're trying to do distance work at home or learning from home. That's reliant on having internet access and cheap and reliable power. And there literally is not a country in Africa that has what you would call reliable power. So that weakness in their power system is really an example of the stark sort of energy inequalities that the region faces. Now, obviously, there's a lot of different countries that are moving in different directions. I'll just highlight a couple that I think really stand out for me. Most importantly, the biggest country by population is Nigeria. And Nigeria is getting slammed by the oil price shock. Oil is about 90% of exports and 2/3 of revenue, and their budget this year had used $57 a barrel as their budget benchmark. They moved it to 30, and now they're thinking about moving it even lower. And I saw that Fitch did a little estimate of what it would take for Nigeria to break even on their budget this year, and that is $144 a barrel. So clearly, they were already in a tight fiscal space, and this is just making that even harder. This is also going to hit on the production side for sure. The big international oil majors in Nigeria need about $20 or $22 to cover production costs. But about a fifth of Nigeria's oil is produced by independent firms, and they generally need about twice this, something like $35 to $40 a barrel just to recover costs. So while it's going to be tough for the big oil majors, it's going to be, it's going to be devastating for the local independent firms. And then again, the power sector, Nigeria has one of the least reliable power sectors, certainly on the planet. A big part of that is that the power system has been bankrupt because the tariffs are far below cost recovery. The plan had been to raise tariffs to inject cash back into the system to pay for maintenance and new investment and all of the things to help build a more reliable power sector. And then COVID strikes, and they've not only scrapped the tariff increase, but they're actually providing free electricity right now, even though the utilities are bankrupt. Another big one in the oil and gas sector is Mozambique. There, the picture actually looks a little mixed. Now, Exxon is looking at a potentially $30 billion investment there. They've delayed a final investment decision. That the COVID pandemic will certainly have been a factor. Might also have been about a really brutal insurgency that seems to be picking up steam in the north. But Total just announced just the other day that it had secured over $14 billion in funding for an LNG project in Mozambique. So that's a little bit mixed. Other countries I watch are Ghana, Senegal, Tanzania. Ghana, the production seems to be holding steady, but they're obviously going to be under pressure for new production. Senegal was hoping to have construction on gas projects. Those all look like those will be delayed. And Tanzania, which was having all kinds of problems in their gas sector, this might just be the final nail in the coffin that means that those projects won't go forward. And then finally, you can't talk about Africa's economy without talking about South Africa. And South Africa, even before COVID struck, its utility, Eskom, which is not just the integrated utility for South Africa, but an important player in the entire region, was on the verge of bankruptcy and only surviving with government bailouts. And this is going to put further pressure on that sector. I really don't know how they're going to climb out of this. And then just for everyone who is interested in tracking COVID, the economic effects and the international response, our friends at the Milken Institute have created a really terrific website called the COVID-19 Africa Watch. And if anybody's interested, I will post the web link there in the chat and share that with everyone. So if you're following Africa, that's a good go-to site. So with that, I'll stop. Thanks, Francisco.
Thank you, Todd. Again, some significant parallels, but some big difference between the three regions. And I do agree that producers that are in the frontier, that are new producers, that are in deep waters, that kind of thing will be hard hit. And the thing to also remember about Africa is that many of these countries are not rich in resources compared to in terms of per capita terms, in terms of how much oil revenues per capita. But nevertheless, for their economies, the dependency is very heavy, like the case of Nigeria, and one wonders if they will be able to diversify in the middle of this political and economic volatility. So moving on a little bit on the politics and geopolitics of what we were witnessing. These events are likely to accelerate some of these difficult trends that these regions were having, that both Jim and Todd mentioned. I mean, in Latin America, one of my biggest concerns is how this will play out politically, because you have already, as I mentioned, very unpopular incumbents. You had a lot of dissatisfaction with democracy. and institutions like we haven't seen in many years in Latin America. And so democracy, there is an erosion of democracy in the region. And even though this crisis might maybe help to lead to regime change in Venezuela and to re-democratize the country, it might also lead to further erosion of democracy in countries like Bolivia or Ecuador, or even countries that have been the beacons of stability in Latin America, like Chile, are facing big political challenges and political instability. And so again, even though the region and I think most countries in the world did a better job at managing the oil boom this time in terms of preparing for the bad times, for the decline in commodity prices, still the volatility it's very unsettling, and of course the magnitude of what we are witnessing and the combination. This is not just a commodity price crisis; it's also a health crisis of gigantic proportions that we haven't seen in 100 years. So I'm concerned about what effects this might happen in the region, and in addition, it might also involve the role of some international powers, like China will probably continue to play a significant role in developing the resources, both energy and mineral resources in these three regions. At the same time, the U.S. seems to be having a less significant role, has been playing a less significant role in Latin America. I wonder if that would be the same in the other two regions. So I wonder, Jim, what do you think could be the political fallout of these events? Could they produce some regime change in the region? Could they put in jeopardy the monarchies in the region, or produce any change? Could it lead to the collapse of the democracy in Iraq, or some additional political instability in the region? And what will be the role of the big powers, Russia, China, and the U.S. in this situation, evolving situation? Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So it's evolving. There's a lot of uncertainty around these questions. Some of the poorer, weaker countries, as you mentioned, Iraq just had a big bout of unrest, and there's there's a new prime minister, but the state is very weak there, and there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the relationship with the U.S. To be blunt, I mean, there's a lot of opposition to the Trump administration's showdown with Iran and how that's materialized on Iraqi soil. So there are certainly dangers of return to unrest, spreading unrest around some of the weaker the republics, the countries that are more populous, and they may be large oil producers, but on a per capita basis, those oil rents don't mean quite as much. Richer countries probably less so, but even there's some major changes that are coming fast, and so Saudi Arabia, for example, using the coronavirus and the crash in oil prices to push through some top-down changes to the social contract, right? So just some big changes being pushed under political cover of low oil prices and coronavirus. So just last week, so let me start. So in 2008, Saudi Arabia imposed a value-added tax, 5%, which was seen as kind of a provocative move. I mean, in these highly autocratic countries, especially the oil-rich ones, you weren't, taxation without representation was supposed to be a no-no, and that a lot of political scientists argued that you really couldn't tax these folks if they didn't have any say in how their tax contributions were spent by the government. Well, Saudi Arabia just raised its value-added tax, tripled it, right, to 15%. Now, there is nothing like this among any of the rich oil-producing countries in the Gulf. They're in uncharted waters with this one. And it's part of a package of austerity cuts. And there's no social input at all. So, Saudi citizens are not being given the right to vote. Now, they've given the women the opportunity to drive cars now. And they've, there's been some social freedoms that have increased, but also increased in repression as well. So that is going to be one to watch. And then, with the sort of ongoing energy transition issues, these countries were all looking at climate change as, the final push that they needed to really get serious about diversifying their economies. And the first one of these to do so, diversifying away from oil, right? So the first one to do so, the first successful post-oil economy in the Middle East is out of Dubai. And we've now seen them succumb twice, right? So, globalized Dubai was really, the poster child for this. But it was having some issues in its real estate market. And now we're seeing, all of its sectors vulnerable to the coronavirus, including real estate, because of the flexible dependence on this flexible expatriate labor. Folks, hundreds of thousands of people are out of work. And right now, most of them are stranded, but until the airport gets running again. But those folks are going to be jumping on flights home. And folks in Dubai are saying, even the government, minimum 10% drop in population this year in Dubai, right? So what do you think that has, kind of impact that has on spending, retail spending, on on the real estate market. So the real estate was already tanking. It dropped about 30% in previous years. So, and a recent poll that just came out found that 70%, fully 70% of private businesses in Dubai expect to close in the next 6 months. Unless they get some kind of serious help from the state. So, a large portion of those are travel and tourism businesses. So there's a lot of rethinking among all the oil states of diversification, how they want to do that. They've got this high rent business in oil that, it fluctuates like it is now. It's a cyclical business, and it's a painful one to be in when prices are down. But it's they're used to that behavior. They're not used to having the diversified side of their economy, the non-oil side, getting hammered so hard. And you're seeing this, elsewhere around the region. So in Dubai, the city, the fathers there have said that, we do need to rethink, maybe revamp our business model, considering permanent residency now for expatriates, so that people don't just pick up and flee, every time there's a downturn. So there'll be some, I think, pretty serious population loss, not just in Dubai, but also the wider UAE and the other countries that have high expatriate populations. So Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, lesser extent Saudi Arabia. I think we're going to see a lot of bankruptcies, defaults, and bailouts. And the bailouts are going to be interesting to watch. There's countries like Oman. It's the largest Arab oil producer that's not in OPEC. Oman's longtime sultan, ruling sultan, Sultan Qaboos, just died in January, just as the coronavirus was taking off in China. And the new Sultan Haitham really just had, took over at a pretty inauspicious time, dealing with austerity, et cetera. It's looking like Oman is going to need a bailout now. Now, the choice for them is going to be, do we take a bailout from the IMF and get some IMF loans, and can we do that, or do we accept one potentially on better terms from the UAE and Saudi Arabia, but then give up some of our political autonomy? And how damaging might that be? I mean, well, Oman was the interlocutor between the U.S. and Iran for the Obama administration in the nuclear, putting together that nuclear deal. Oman's been a really valuable partner geopolitically for the West in dealing with Iran, and actually when dealing now with in dealing with Yemen. So we'd hate to lose a neutral Iran. So there's a same thing. Dubai faces the same problem. If Abu Dhabi bails it out like it did last time, can the massive Emirates Airlines, really successful state-owned company, is that going to be on the block? Is that something that might be the price of a bailout? Will we see Emirates join up with Etihad, for example, and having a single airline? I think there's a lot of consolidation in the airline industry. Gulf Air of Bahrain is a weak one. Oman Air may potentially, smaller budget carriers, lots of those around the Middle East, some of the weaker banks, et cetera. So I think all eyes are on the oil price, which is starting to improve, and as well as vaccine development. And either one of these would provide a little bit more breathing room. But they, politically, in terms of unrest, I mean, there are I wouldn't oversell instability in some of the wealthier countries. I mean, they've got they have these flexible labor markets that allow them to kind of deport the problem, if you will. If you lose your job and you don't get another one in 30 days, technically you're supposed to leave. The tribal links are also helpful. There's sheikhs, tribal sheikhs that have ties with the rulers in most of these countries, and so that also helps. Further, sort of more broadly, I would say the U.S. role in the region is coming under strain now. There's some serious reconsideration of the Carter Doctrine that has the U.S. Declaring it'll come to do everything up to and including war if its allies in the Persian Gulf are threatened. I think there's some folks in Washington reconsidering that. Meanwhile, we've got Russia and China taking much bigger roles in the Gulf. Even with Israel, U.S. ties with Israel are being questioned now by the Democratic Party. So there's a lot of flux in Middle East, in relations with the Middle East. And then the countries in the region, probably partially as a result, are becoming much more forceful in their own foreign policies. So Saudi Arabia is reemerging as a big player in OPEC, as we've seen with the price war, and then calling that price war off and imposing unprecedentedly huge cuts to oil production, but also interfering in the region. Saudi, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, all much more interventionist foreign policies around the region. Some of those starting to be cut back a little bit. UAE and Saudi now kind of backing off this really hard line against Iran. I think they're seeing that if the Trump administration really is going to come down to a showdown with Iran, it's probably a lot of that's going to take place on their territory, and Iran's retaliation would probably be against them rather than against the U.S. directly, and that does not not appealing to them. So I think they're backing away from some of that. So I'll leave that there and hand it back.
Sure. So we are getting some questions, and please, if you want to make questions through the Q&A or the chat function, please do so. We are going to start to answer them now. But Todd, I wanted to give you a chance to also comment on the sort of the geopolitics and the fallout in terms of the politics in the region, in terms of democracy, regime change, etc. But also, if you already want to start answering, I don't know if you have read any of the questions, you can do so, and please Jim, do the same, sort of check the questions, and then I will give you a chance to answer some of the questions. Go ahead, Todd, please.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. And I hope that we're going to hear from you about how the effects on Venezuela. So I hope you'll come back on after that. So look, just to be very quick here, there are lots of, looking at the effects on democracy, we're seeing a lot of the authoritarian regimes using the cover of the lockdown to clamp down on the opposition. Cameroon's a good example. Zimbabwe is actually a really disturbing example, where just last week an opposition member of parliament was kidnapped and tortured. And Tanzania is also, is seeing increased repression under the guise of COVID. But what I think we're really seeing is that the stark differences in government capability. You're seeing countries like Rwanda and Ghana respond in a way that makes sense, and that the public is seeing a public health response to what they're dealing with. And that, I think, in certain places, that will increase trust in government. We're also seeing an interesting trend in Africa of some of the big name philanthropists stepping up and stepping into a void. So Dangote in Nigeria has been making big health donations. Strive Masiyiwa, a Zimbabwean cell phone entrepreneur, has been sending ventilators back to his home country from South Africa. So you are seeing an effect on governance and different actors who are responding or not. And then, the very good question about U.S. Position. Despite sort of a lot of rhetoric from the U.S., we're clearly seeing the U.S. leadership step back in the region, and China very clearly stepping into that void. The administration tries to pose this as a great power competition, but for the most part, we're voluntarily ceding that space to China, and in some places to Russia as well. So I don't know if you want me to turn to some of Francisco to turn to some of the questions now, or you want to go.
If you already have read them, yes, please do so. If otherwise, we can go to Jim and then.
Okay, yeah, it looked like there were maybe 3 or 4 questions all around renewable energy and the effects on the energy transition, which is a great question. And the big picture is we're still not really sure what the effects are going to be. Africa already is an environment for an incredible amount of experimentation in the renewable energy sector. There's just a ton of fascinating things going on, wind, solar, geothermal, hydro, everything you can imagine is going on. We're definitely going to see an increase in the case for renewable energy and distributed renewable energy as a tool of climate resilience. We're definitely going to hear about that, but I think that the reality is going to provide some pretty big headwinds for that. So if you think first of what's the competition for renewable energy, in most places it's diesel generators. And the decline in oil prices is going to keep the diesel price low. And that's going to make it much, much harder for some of the renewable energy alternatives. The cost of capital for emerging markets is also going to be a lot higher. It's going to be really tough for a lot of these startups to find capital investment, especially for upfront capital intensive projects like wind and solar. And we're also, I think, going to see, I mentioned earlier in my comments that the utilities are all under severe pressure. Well, they're going to be under even more financial pressure, and they're going to really want to push down their prices, and that's going to put additional pressure on new renewable energy projects. So I think it's going to be a little bit of a tough environment for at least the next 12 to 24 months. And then, in the electricity sector, there's certainly a movement toward distributed renewables, solar home systems, and mini grids. We're going to see if the solar home system providers are going to be able to survive this credit crunch. And we'll see how fast the mini grids are going to be able to push down their prices to be able to compete again with diesel. So a lot of the mini grid systems in Africa, the effective tariff is around $1 a kilowatt hour. Some of the better ones are 70 cents or so. They had been hoping in 2 or 3 years to get down to around 30 cents, which would start to compete with diesel. So we'll see if they're going to be able to do that. But I do think it's going to be a very, very tough environment. It's just still a little bit early to know how bad it'll get.
Great, thank you. I will answer two of the questions that are regarding Latin America. One is about what will happen with the dictatorship in Venezuela with the current crisis, and the other one is about Mexico's democracy. On the Venezuela side, this is a situation that it's unprecedented. The country faced a decline of 2/3 of GDP before COVID-19. And at the beginning of this year, it seemed like this was going to be the least bad year in the last 5. But now it's probably going to be the worst ever, with a decline of 20% of GDP coming from the decline of 2/3 that I mentioned, and with hyperinflation, with remittances, which were the other things sort of saving the Venezuelan economy and much of its population that are collapsing too. The 5 million Venezuelans that have left the country are losing their jobs in the region. And so it is a sort of a perfect storm for the regime. But on the other hand, they have been able to sustain this massive collapse of the economy without major sort of breaks in the coalition, in the government coalition, and in the military. Perhaps, there are sort of two arguments for why they have been able to sustain this. One is the role of the Cubans in terms of intelligence, and they have thousands of advisors in Venezuela, and they have a high stake in the regime surviving. The Russians have also played a role, and now the Iranians are also helping the Venezuelan regime. So the military seem to, contrary to what many expected, and the US clearly expected, that the sanctions will generate divisions within the military. They seem to have coalesced around the government, and in fear of what might happen to them if they lose power. Nevertheless, this is, as I said as before, unprecedented. So I think it's hard to know if there will be a collapse in the regime, but the situation is going to be really dire. In terms of Mexico is also facing a very difficult situation. The country had a very high level of dissatisfaction that led to the election of Andrés Manuel López Obrador as president, and the economy was doing badly even in the first year, in the middle of a situation of growth in the US, which was unprecedented, that decoupling. And so the combination of a difficult economic situation with high levels of dissatisfaction and the lack of a significant alternative to Mr. López Obrador, who's still a relatively highly popular president, I think represent a very tough challenge for Mexico's democracy, which is a very young democracy. If you think about it, it's 20 years since it has become a competitive democracy. So it's going to be really challenging dealing with a populist president that doesn't face a clear and unified opposition, and significant dissatisfaction with the economy, and also tremendous dissatisfaction with the democracy, the elites, and a powerful role for criminal groups. So I'm not saying that the democracy will fail in Mexico, but it's a very concerning situation. With that, we have only about 5 more minutes, so I want to give chance for Jim and Todd to answer some of the questions, and then I will wrap up at the end. But go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, I'll just take a couple of these and wrap them together real quick. So there was a question about the Carter Doctrine and a question about oil price wars. I'll try and wrap those two up. So Carter Doctrine, it's gone through a few iterations, right? I mean, it was based on the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and President Carter's fears about the Soviet Union, taking Iran and getting, coming all the way down to the Gulf, right? So it's not that about that any longer. It's more about protecting, flows of oil, massive exports of oil through the Strait of Hormuz, and to keeping the global economy stable. But it's been coming under challenge because the U.S., for various reasons, right? So some of this is isolationist policy that started under Obama and is even stronger under Trump. But it's also coming under challenge because, the U.S. does not import much of that oil directly anymore. Most of our imports, such as they are coming from Canada now. And there's lots of oil around the Western Hemisphere. U.S. is now an oil producer, is now a competitor, essentially to Saudi Arabia, Russia and others. We also compete with now. And since 2016, the U.S. has been basically free riding on OPEC's cuts. OPEC, of course, Saudis and Russians not amused by that, and there's been some grumbling and some suggestion that the price war, the Saudi-Russian price war that we saw kicking off earlier this year, was partially to try and clip the wings of shale and bring shale production down. I mean, since 2016, shale oil production had grown by about 4.5 million barrels a day, while Saudi and Russia were trimming their production. So really allowed the U.S. to kind of leap ahead of them as an oil producer, based on their own, Saudi and Russian and OPEC sacrifices. So, once the price war launched, the dialogue got even uglier, and we saw folks like Texas Senator Ted Cruz saying that OPEC market management and was basically a part of the deal for the Carter Doctrine, that the $100 billion plus per year that the U.S. spends protecting the Persian Gulf was somehow, he didn't say it quite in this way, but was predicated on continued OPEC cuts and continued assistance for shale from OPEC. So it seems that U.S. relationship, the changing U.S. economy, the rise in oil production, some of the isolationism and populism, nationalism that we're seeing, and the Carter Doctrine are at loggerheads. It's weakening, and it's not just on the Republican side. It's really across the political spectrum. There are thinkers on both sides that in various parts of the spectrum, actually, who think it's no longer necessary, even from based on military technology too. Do we need so many bases, so many personnel directly in the Middle East in such a close relationship? So that hasn't been lost on the folks in the Gulf. I mean, Iran, of course, would like to see self-sufficiency from the Gulf neighbors, to take care of their own security. And I was in Saudi Arabia earlier this year and discussed this with some folks, and they were saying, well, look, we're going to have to handle this ourselves, maybe with a little help from China or Russia, we'll see. So it's really one of those kind of slow evolutions and something to stay tuned on.
Okay, so I think we will finish with Todd answering some of the questions that you can in a couple of minutes, and then we wrap up. Go ahead, Todd.
Okay, I know we're at time, so I'll be real quick. There was one good question about what does COVID mean for energy as an essential service when you've got 600 million people that don't even have lights at home. Look, I think that this entire episode is going to help people reevaluate what it means to have modern energy access. If it turns out that the COVID vaccine means we need refrigeration, if people need access to 24/7 data or the internet, it's going to have to be more than a couple of lights at home. It's going to have to be robust, reliable, affordable power systems that can deliver on all of the services that people are going to need to live modern lives and to compete in a tough, global economy. So I think we're going to start to see the ambition bar raised. There'll be a big meeting, hopefully in February in Rwanda for the Sustainable Energy for All, and I think there we're going to see a lot of messaging about making sure that this tremendous gap we have between the haves and have-nots in global energy is closed. So thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Todd, for that fast intervention. So with this, we will wrap up. Thank you for joining us, and thanks to Jim and Todd for sharing their thoughts on this fascinating topic. We will continue to have on Fridays these webinars organized by the Center for Energy Studies. And please do check up our events on Fridays, and also the other events of the Baker Institute on other topics. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.